Hello. Okay, Clara has just agreed to come back tomorrow night and meet Will, who was the boy that she kept seeing outside the hothouses, who we found out works with the boiler. That's why he's got a really bad cough and grubby hair and grubby face. Okay. Chapter 10. Stolen Fruit. Clara rubbed the tiredness from her eyes as she sat at the breakfast table the next morning. She had only been staying with the Gilberts for 6 days, but so much had happened the previous day and night. It felt like forever. Mrs. Gilbert had left a pot of porridge warming on the small stove before heading to the big house for another day of housekeeping. Mr. Gilbert took a glass jar of honey from the shelf. The honeycomb glistened, jewel-like, in the shaft of sun hitting the table. The golden sweetness dripped from the wooden spoon into his milking porridge. "Read there was another Zeppelin attack on the Norfolk coast," he said gruffly, glancing at his open newspaper. His voice startled the tiredness from Clara's eyes. 2 killed and some badly injured. This war is getting too close for comfort. He gave her a sidelong glance. Clara's porridge stuck to her throat. She coughed, took a sip of her warm milk. Before they had stopped getting the regular newspapers at home, Clara had used to scowl at the images of Zeppelins, those huge pencil-shaped floating machines with the capacity to drop bombs from their gondola and blow entire houses to smithereens, so they're like big floating airships that they used to have. The thought made her skin shudder and prickle in equal parts. Were the Germans really going to send hundreds of those flying machines to obliterate England? The previous year, her cousins, who lived in London borough of Shoreditch, had witnessed the bombing of the Empire Music Hall while a performance was taking place. The whole family had been so terrified that they had left their terraced house and moved to Cornwall. Cornwall would be safer than London. Wasn't Norfolk mostly open fields like Cornwall and Devon? Maybe the Zeppelins would be heading for the south coast too, where her cousins were living and where mother and father were staying. The image of her father's cone of chips splattered on the seafront sprang to her head. Sickness washed over her. She placed her cup down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Mr. Gilbert's forehead bunched under his dishevelled hair. He gave her a tentative smile and leaned forwards, placing his hand on the flat of the table. "Now look, Clara, the thing is," he was interrupted by a firm rap at the door. It squeaked open and cold air hurtled down the hallway. "Mr. Gilbert, are you in?" asked a voice which Clara recognised. Mr. Gilbert tore his eyes away from Clara, sighed and pushed his chair back. Clara stared out of the kitchen window. It was smeared and grimy with dirt. On the draining board were cloths and a bucket, presumably for Clara to start cleaning with. Clara thought about the cobwebs Mr. Gilbert's hair had picked up when she first arrived, the bumped skirting board, the peeling wallpaper, and crumbling plaster. Mrs. Gilbert was a housekeeper, yet from her own house you would never guess what her profession actually was. "Pineapples," Clara heard Robert say in the hall. Clara's thoughts stilled. "How many?" Mr. Gilbert said. His voice was high, tinged with panic. "3 of them," Robert said. "Some peaches have been stolen too." Clara thought about the fruit she had knocked from the tree the night before, the lime leaves Will had pressed between the pages of his notebook, the mandarin she had found on the tree stump, and the one Will had seen in the reeds near the lake. There was a lengthy pause. Clara quietly pushed her chair back and crept to the kitchen door, placing her ear to the wood. "Does anyone else know about this?" Mr. Gilbert asked swiftly. "No? Good, keep it that way. If someone from the estate's doing the thieving, we don't want them to know that we're onto them." "It wouldn't be anyone from here," Robert said. Clara peeked around the edge of the door. Robert's face was flushed. "Maybe, maybe not," said Mr. Gilbert, rubbing his chin. "What about the rifle regiment?" Robert said. "Them and all sorts are wandering the estate these days and nights. Shall I go and visit them?" "No," said Mr. Gilbert firmly. A little too firmly, Clara thought. "Keep your eyes and ears open though, lad. If you see anything suspicious, let me know." "Yes, Mr. Gilbert," Robert said, pushing his shoulders back. "You can trust me, sir." Robert's adamant apple bobbed in his throat. It's the bit that sticks out in a man's throat, like a frog trying to leap from a lily pad. I know I can. Mr. Gilbert paused, pushing his hands into his trouser pocket. I also feel badly that you can't enlist next year when you're 18. The colour of Robert's cheeks deepened. I do, sir. I feel very badly indeed. Seeing all those lads go off to fight, it makes me feel a little useless. I know it, Mr. Gilbert said softly, but you need to concentrate on the gardens. They need you, as do I. There is much to be done. Mr. Gilbert cleared his throat. Right, come on. I want to see the results of this thieving for myself. I'll fetch my jacket. He walked back down the hall towards the kitchen. Clara spun around and picked up the bucket of rags. Mr. Gilbert brushed past Clara as if she was invisible, spooned a final mouthful of porridge into his mouth, picked up his jacket from the back of his chair, and left. When the Earl finds out about this, there'll be hell to pay, she heard him mutter as he stomped down the hall. Every window in the house rattled in agreement as the door to the gardens banged shut behind him. Clara stared after him, then placed the bucket and rags down and brushed off her apron. Fruit had been lost as well as found. Could the stolen pineapples and the found mandarins have been connected? She made a decision. As soon as she finished cleaning windows, she was going to explore the gardens and see what else she could find before she visited Will that night. Will seemed to have a keen affection for the plants growing in the hothouse, and was likely to be interested and also upset to hear about the stolen fruit. Chapter 11. Tiger the dog. Tiger the dog. The morning sun bounced on the window of the hothouse, making Clara squint. The day was as crisp and golden as the apples on the trees. She chewed on a fingernail as she walked past the house and down the slope to the Earl's summer house. It was particularly built into the garden's inner walls, which sectioned off the different planting areas, its three huge windows facing the lake. The brick walls continued either side of the summer house, then turned at right angles towards the lake, enclosing a large lawn where Clara could imagine grand summer picnics and moonlit parties taking place. As she stood on the edge of the lawn near the water, she saw a sparkling chandelier hanging from the ceiling of the summer house. Perfect mandarin trees, oranges hanging from them like Christmas bulbs lined the back wall. White wicker chairs were scattered with silky cloud-like cushions. Sunlight reflected off the condensation on the inside of the glass. A man was sitting on one of the chairs. His head was dipped towards a newspaper spread across his lap. A pipe was resting on the table next to him, small puffs of smoke reaching for the ceiling. There was no sign of the small girls with their nanny or the lady with the parasol who had chivied them towards the summer house when Clara had saw them yesterday. Perhaps the girls were having lessons with a governess in the big house, learning about exciting things. Governesses were like teachers hired personally for the children in the house, so the governess would live there and just be their teacher all the time. Clara thought of Elsa and her other friends at school, and a pinch of sadness tightened her throat. She bowed her head and secured the ribbons on her straw boater, her hat, remembering Mrs. Gilbert's instructions about not making eye contact with the Earl. If she was to be staying with Mr. and Mrs. Gilbert a while longer, then she needed a friend, and she was hopeful she may have found one in Will. And if he was a friend, then maybe he would help her piece together the mystery of the fruit thief. She remembered him saying that the boiler room was behind the summer house, underground, so she turned backwards towards the kitchen gardens, heading along the wall on the other side of the summer house lawn until she thought she might be in the right place. Her eyes skirted over a lone wasp, dipping and dancing over two barrows of peelings to a low brick red wall. The gardens here were in sharp contrast to the neatly manicured lawns in front of the summer house. Bales of straw were bursting from the strings tied around their middles, and an assortment of rusting gardening tools were scattered across the rough ground. This must be a part of the gardens that the girl and his family never visited. Clara walked the wall and ran her fingers over the bricks. It was then that she saw the steps, hidden from the view behind two straw bales. At the front of the steps was a blue wooden door, the paint cracked and peeling. She stood and gazed down at it. Will had to be in there. Was he sleeping? Maybe drawing in his notebook. Did he know anything about the stolen fruit? Maybe he had heard something whilst he was roaming the gardens at night. A horrible thought wormed its way into her gut, but before she had time to properly acknowledge it, she heard a voice. So we don't know what that thought was. All right, miss. Clara swiveled around. A man and his small brown and white spaniel was standing there looking at her. The dog's head was tilted as if it wanted to ask Clara a question too, its pink tongue lolling. The man was chewing noisily on an apple, which was almost down to its core. He spat a pip onto the grass. The dog sniffed at it. I'm George, one of the gamekeepers, the man said. I've seen you about. I'm guessing you're Alfred's niece. Clara nodded, her fingers fizzling. Was George... fizzing, not fizzling. Was George wondering what she was doing there? Did he know about Will? I'm just back from the woods. It's the start of the pheasant season, George said, although I reckon all the rifle fire at night is scaring them off. Didn't catch a thing this morning. So he shoots pheasants, the birds. Oh, replied Clara, staring at the gun he was carrying over his left shoulder. You shoot just birds. Birds and deer. Sometimes rabbits too. The Earl does like a slice of cook's rabbit and rosemary pie, but we can't be too choosy now, what with the war and so many men gone. Only 10 men working on the estate now. Used to be 6 times that. So there used to be 60 men, but now they're only down to 10 because of the war. George sighed heavily, reached down and tickled between his spaniel's ear. All those people to look after one Earl and his family, Clara thought. What would it like to have people hunting, gardening, cooking and cleaning for you each and every day? George looked over Clara's shoulder down the steps. You were looking at the boiler house. His dog scampered down the steps and began scrabbling at the door. Click, 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 click went the dog's nails against the wood. It whined and click, click some more. George frowned. Tiger, come back here, he said, giving the dog a whistle. But Tiger, who definitely did not live up to his name in looks, oh, maybe it's Tigger, continued to ignore him. Tiger, called Clara. Come on, boy. Maybe you could smell Will and hear him cough. Maybe it could smell Will and hear him coughing. But George followed Tiger and started to investigate. It's a girl dog, George said tartly. Boy, girl, did it matter? The dog needed to leave the door alone. Clara ran down the steps and scooped Tiger up into her arms. The dog protested and wriggled in fury. Careful, she bites, said George. Clara held Tiger at arm's length while the dog's jaws gnashed and nipped at Clara without success. If only it had been you in my nightmare, maybe I wouldn't have been so scared and Mrs. Gilbert would not have lost all her hair, Clara muttered. The dog quietened and regarded her steadily. Then it yawned, its body going limp. Clara held the dog closer to her chest. It turned its head and licked her hand. Its tongue was rough and wet and made Clara giggle. She likes you, George said, tilting his head. At the top of the steps he took the dog from Clara and fondled its ears. Nothing but trouble, this one, he said softly. Quite useless as a hunter, but can't bear to get rid of the wee thing. His eyes flicking to the steps again. What were you doing down these parts of the gardens anyway? Clara's brain whirled. She walked to one of the barrows of peelings, swatted away 2 more wasps which had come to join their friends, and lifted the handles. I was about to take this to the compost, she said. The muscles in her arms groaned as she lifted the handles. She paused. She pushed it forwards, and it wobbled to the side, spilling peelings onto the grass. The metal handles dug into her finger, which were already red raw and cracked from washing windows all morning. What's going on? Robert had appeared and set down the bale of straw he had been carrying on his shoulders. She was taking it to the compost, George said, throwing his apple core into the barrow. Clara grunted as she tried to steer the barrow along the grass path towards the east wall, where she had seen the compost heaps on her wondering, Tiger dancing and yapping around her feet. Clara, Mr. Gilbert came striding towards her, his face rosy. She's taking it to the compost, said George and Robert at the exact same time. Clara could feel her cheeks flushing. She dropped the barrow with a whump and wiped her hands on the apron. I'm just trying to be useful, she said. Here, let me, Robert said, taking the handles from her. "No, I can do it," said Clara. The barrow shook and swayed along the grass as Clara gritted her teeth, their 3 men following behind, picking up falling peelings and throwing them back into the barrow as she heaved and pushed. At last, the compost heap was in sight. Robert stepped forward to help Clara tip the barrow. "No, let me," Clara said breathlessly. The barrow tipped, the contents splurging onto the pile of decaying, sweet-smelling mulch. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Gilbert's lips were quirked into the smallest of smiles. "You'll find a wicker basket beyond the orchard, against the back wall. Only pick the ripest apples." A gentle tug, and they should come loose. "Tell Robert when you are done. He can load them onto the cart for the hospital." Giving Clara a quick nod, he strode back down the hill. So she wanted to help, and she's finally been given a job. Robert grinned. "Looks like you'll be helping in the gardens then," he said. "I'm glad. You're a hard worker. I think we'll get on well enough." Clara grinned, bent down and stroked Tiger, who was still sniffing around her feet. George tipped his cap, whistled to his dog, and walked on. Clara's shoulders ached. Her head was hot under her hat. Her thumb had blisters on from clenching the handles of the barrow. Still, it felt good to be outside with everyone else, actually doing something to help the war effort. But then a horrible worm-like thought that had been burrowing into her since she stood outside the boiler house returned. Willard asked Clara to keep his presence a secret, and what if there was more than one reason he was so keen to stay hidden? Could he have something to do with the missing fruit? And at that, we will leave it there and we'll find out tomorrow. Okay, see you then.